the present state of capitalism in its financialized form. We're going to begin with Levitt Desai. She is from the University of Manitoba. She is the author of a very interesting book on Geopolitics, which actually I have managed to read, or at least to have read to me some of the chapters and the summary of contents. And she is going to announce the title of her own. I'm going to introduce the whole panel, I think, and then you have to deal with that miserable business about the time. Michael Hudson. Michael Hudson is going to speak about anthropology, is it? And?
Polanyi.
Polanyi. Michael Hudson is an extraordinarily interesting person with many skills and a lifetime of interesting activities. Is currently connected with the people in Kansas, Missouri, and modern monetary theory, MMT, I think they call it. He has a book very much on that subject, The Bubble and Beyond, and tells me he's now on the next book. Palacios is an old friend. Been at many of our conferences before, University of Guadalajara in Mexico, and speaking on a subject very dear to my heart, which I think a discourse which began perhaps with my father's famous 1945 article on universal capitalism versus regional economic planning, and at that time he believed that only the Americans believed in universal capitalism. Unfortunately, that turned out to be premature. We have Oscar Ugarteche, who is presently at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and is an incredibly knowledgeable expert on the financialized world, who is going to present to you a fascinating paper which I have read on the way in which capitalism has morphed into a financial monster of some kind. He will explain. So let us start with Levitt, please. Would everyone please go to the podium so you can clearly see the time?
Carrie, if I'm going to be the timekeeper, could you tell me how long each person has? Is it 15
everyone has a very strict limit of 15 minutes.
15 minutes.
And you can get a warning at 10 or 5, whatever you think is appropriate, and another one at 2. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Karl, for the kind introduction, and thank you all for being here at this early hour after a long day yesterday. I will go straight to business. When Karl invited me to talk, I thought I would stick my neck out and promise to talk about something that I have been thinking about for a long time. And so I thought if I promised to talk about it, I would be forced to put my thoughts together. And that's precisely what has happened. So I want to talk about money / capital as a fictitious commodity. I would say that in the Great Transformation, it is the chief organizing idea. It's the always vain commodification of money and the weighty action that states take against it. That is the master logic of capitalist society. It is the one that explains the disintegration of liberal civilization in a liberal capitalism in 1914 in the opening chapters of the Great Transformation. Despite its centrality, however, it is the least understood of the concepts of fictitious commodities. And I would say that is at least for two reasons. Probably there are more. There is a widespread mystification of both the origins of money and the particular appeal of the idea of commodity money. One may clarify here, because it will become relevant later, that Marx did not have a commodity theory of money. In fact, his understanding of money helps us to understand the very idea of commodity money as a bourgeois fetish. The second reason for this lack of understanding of what it means to say that money is a fictitious commodity is that discussions of central banking, regarded by Polanyi as the leading edge of the movement for social protection in response to the commodification of money, are generally considered the rarefied domain of technical experts. There are, of course, in addition to this, the multiplying mythologies with regard to both money itself and especially world money that have systematically issued from the highest portals of power in our century, well, in the last century, of US power. From Charles Kindleberger's idea of US hegemony down to Haussmann and Sturzenegger's conception of dark matter, to justify and naturalize the US dollar's volatile and unnatural world role, and the series of volatile and unstable dollar-denominated financializations that it has relied on since 1971. Of course, these reasons basically amount to little more than saying that this is because of commodity fetishism, that you don't understand the fictitious commodity character of money. The implications of the fictitious commodity character of money are quite dramatic for actually existing capitalism, and I use this term in like Rudolf Barrow and other Eastern intellectuals, Eastern European intellectuals did, to name their system as a form of, they call their actually existing socialism, to name it, but at the same time distinguish it from the ideal, but at the same time then use it to investigate its dynamics. So I think we should also be using actually existing capitalism to understand the capitalisms in which we live. I would say that in doing this, I'm also appealing to a broader lineage of thought from classical political economy onwards. And in my book, which Karl spoke of, Geopolitical Economy, by the way, brief commercial break, I'm one of those authors who carries around a few copies to sell at a very discounted price. So if, in fact, let me put this in circulation. If people are interested, I have a few copies. Anyway, so basically I feel that if you take the tradition of classical political economy and basically from there onwards, simply leave out all those who subscribe to what I call Ricardo's two fictions, Say's law and comparative advantage, which justify respectively free markets and free trade, then actually we have quite a rich tradition of trying to understand what our real world is all about, both political economy and what I call geopolitical economy. So this would include classical political economy up to and including Marx and Engels, the classical theories of imperialism, and the theory of uneven and combined development, the non-Marxist neoliberals thinking such as that of John Hobson, 20th century critics of neoclassical economics such as Keynes, Polanyi, Minsky, the developmental state tradition, and so on. So now I want to talk a little bit about just fictitious commodities and make a few points which are relevant before going on to talking about money as a fictitious commodity. I'd like to underline here that there is a tendency to oppose Marx and Polanyi on their respective conceptions of capitalism. But I would say that this is not a good thing to do. In fact, they are very compatible. By the way, I think that both Polanyans and Marxists are responsible for this false opposition. Polanyi's idea of fictitious commodities was rooted in Marx's discussion in what Hobsbawm would later call pre-capitalist economic formations, the entire thrust of which was to make capitalism, which separated human beings from nature and society, seem unnatural. And this was precisely contrary to the Enlightenment tradition of trying to make capitalist and market relations seem natural and feudalism seem unnatural. Moreover, there are all too many indications of Marx and Engels' recognition of the impossibility of the full commodification and the existence, therefore, of a society beyond commodification. There are firstly the scathing references to the sale of things like honor and virtue, which clearly bespeak an understanding that there are many things that are not produced for sale but which are sold nonetheless. There is secondly the clear recognition of national differences in the development of capitalism, clearly a form of embeddedness that differs between societies. And so each country has its own distinctive class formations, its distinctive institutions, and even its distinctive culture and philosophy. In these discussions, Marx and Engels clearly foreshadow what would later be termed uneven and combined development. There is thirdly their critique of imperialism, in which both the capitalist society and the society, capitalist economy and society confront another society which is envisaged as potentially succumbing or reacting with a national/bourgeois revolution. Above all, however, it is important to understand that Marx and Engels never subscribed to any notion of pure capitalism. Indeed, Engels is even quoted as having said that not only isn't there one, there never will be, because we revolutionaries will never let it come to that. So there is no pure capitalism, and so notwithstanding Marx's strictures to his German comrades, de te fabula narratur, the story is told about you. In fact, it especially did not exist in England. Marx and Engels were clearly aware of it. How else is one to explain the subordination of the industrial interest, for instance, to the commercial and financial one in the very birthplace of the Industrial Revolution? Marx and Engels also understood the expansion of the state's domestic economic role on behalf of society. Engels foresaw that capitalism socialized production, and this would create a contradiction between private ownership and the socialization of production, and eventually force capitalists into trusts, which would then lead the official representative of capitalist society, the state, to undertake the direction of production, while Marx While Marx discussed the socialization of production and the increasing role that this would require of the state and how this would set the stage for socialism in a key chapter in Volume 3. Both competition between capitalists and class struggle between classes, the two key dynamics of capitalism, would make their own contribution to increasing the economic role of states. Marx had argued that under free competition, the immanent laws of capitalism confront the individual capitalist as a coercive force, external to him, and capitalists therefore agitate for regulatory legislation. This is a quote from him. Further, he, in his discussion of the extensive struggles over labor legislation in Volume 1, Marx clearly says, capital takes no account of the health and length of life of the worker unless society forces it to do so. He clearly demonstrated a recognition that there was something called society beyond the capitalist economy. On the other hand, it is not simply the case that Polanyi thought of the double movement in terms of some abstract generalization called society. When you read what he talks about, he clearly understands that there are classes, parties, factions, groups that are responsible for particular installments of the double movement. So, having laid that out, I think we should move away from a false opposition between Marx and Polanyi. I now want to talk a little bit about money as a fictitious commodity. Money is a fictitious commodity because as Polanyi very clearly lays out, it is the basic institution of organization of capitalist society. It is not produced for sale. Its sale would amount to putting society itself, including its material basis, material sociality itself, for sale. Money also pre-exists capitalist society. As others will point out, they're far more erudite about than me, Michael, for example, but it originates as a means of payment. The impossibility, and commodity money, in fact, is impossible. So Marx is very aware of this. In fact, in discussing the circulation of minted precious metal coins, for example, he points out that they were more or less instantly reduced to symbols of themselves, in that they circulate at par, not because of the weight of precious metals, which we cannot check, which are often eroded away, but because the sovereign promises to exchange them for par. So the reason why they circulate has nothing to do with the fact that they are composed of some commodity. Marx also recognizes that money has little or no cost of production, so that its price has no natural basis. There is no natural rate of interest, he says. The rate of interest is determined primarily by supply and demand. Marx's discussion of interest-bearing capital clearly recognized that since it pre-exists productive, that is to say agricultural or industrial capital, and he anticipated that over time, as capitalism developed, it would subordinate interest-bearing capital to its own logic. Michael has discussed this very well. And so he expected that the pre-capitalist logic, in which the lender was superior to the supplicant borrower, would be replaced by a new logic based on the transformed figure of the borrower, no longer a supplicant in dire straits, but a capitalist to whom money is lent on the expectation that he will use it to appropriate unpaid labor. The classical Marxists of the next generation who wrote about the transformations of capitalism attendant on the Second Industrial Revolution contrasted the continental pattern of finance capital, which fit this view of the subordination of financial capital to productive capital, with the British pattern, which still seemed to conform to the pre-capitalist pattern. My book tells the story of why this pre-capitalist pattern continued even after the collapse of the London-centered world financial order and the so-called gold standard in 1914. Indeed, Pierre Villard points out in his history of gold and money that commodity money is in fact antithetical to capitalist society because its deflationary bias goes against the need of capitalism for buoyant prices. So, Polanyi's great insight was to see that central banking was the answering movement of social protection against the commodification of money, and he was absolutely right. In the late 19th century is when you begin to see the beginnings of, I'll take a couple more minutes, but I'm nearly done. The beginnings of various countries acquiring central, so even when the Bank of England existed for a long time, it begins to acquire the distinctive functions of central banking around this time. Polanyi's chief limitation, however, on this front was to imagine that the gold standard ever functioned in the textbook fashion, and even to imagine that haute finance was a force for peace in the 19th century. By the late 19th and early 20th century, the latter, that is to say haute finance, centered in the city of London, was merely one among many competing protagonists in the wider unfolding of what the Bolsheviks would call uneven and combined development, in which Britain's industrial and imperial supremacy set off the contender industrialization behind protectionist walls based on a conscious rejection of free trade ideology in the US, Germany, Japan, and elsewhere. And the dual competition, industrial and imperial, culminates in the First World War. Polanyi also failed to consider exactly what was involved in the displacement of the contradictions of capitalism, the problems of capitalism, as he would see it in terms of the fictitious commodities, to the international sphere, whereas I think that both in Marx as well as in the classical theories of imperialism and ideas about uneven and combined development, you have the elements of an understanding of this, because Marx says, for example, in his writings on Henry Carey at the very end of the Grundrisse, he says he thinks of the world market as the grandest terrain in which the disharmony of capitalist relations appear in their grandest development as the relations of producing nations. So in a sense, for interform...
that you will have very soon to finish.
Yes.
And on that note, which is a very, very interesting what you just said.
Okay. I just make one final point, yes, which is that because I have a lot more to say, but it's very important to understand that the gold standard never really functioned as it was said, and therefore in the post-war era, what we have to remember is that the dollar has always required a series of fictions and a series of extremely volatile practices to keep up its role as the world's money. And in fact, if you were to really think about the kind of international monetary order that we would really need in order for there to be a stable world money, we would have to go back to thinking about Keynes and his Banco and his International Clearing Union, which would also begin the double movement.
Thank you very, very much. Michael Hudson at the podium. And I leave it to the self-organization of the speaker and Andre to terminate the session at 15 minutes because of all the things that Margie told us.
Well, I've decided to talk about Polanyi and anthropology because in antiquity you had the same kind of decontextualization and disembedding of social institutions that the world is going through today. You had it, first of all, in 1200 BC, when the Bronze Age Near Eastern civilization had very bad weather, fell apart, many folk wanderings, many invasions, and for 500 years there was a dark age. When Western civilization recovered, all of a sudden what had been a palace and temple economy in the Near East became an oligarchy. In Mycenaean Greece, around 1200, you had local palace collectors called basilii. Basil. When we pick up the Greek language around 750 BC, the word basil is the word for king. So all these local managers somehow made themselves local rulers. It's very much like what happened in Russian privatization or gravitization. And it's also what happened in Rome when you had finally the money economy collapse. I'm going to explain how civilization began with a credit economy. Long before there was money, there were debts. There were weregild debts, personal debts, there were dowries. These were usually handled in batches of commodities. Money, as such, was developed by the Sumerian temples in the 3rd millennium BC. And they were essentially developed to denominate debt. This is an agricultural economy. The palace and the temples would advance agricultural goods, irrigation work, and also during the harvest season, the cultivators would run up debts to the palace. They would run up debts, for instance, to beer alewomen for the beer that they drink. All these debts were to be paid on the threshing floor when the harvest was in. So, and the debts were basically part of an overall accounting system that was developed in Sumer. If you're running a large palace or a large temple, you have a specialization of labor, and you need some kind of common denominator so that you can reduce all of the different products, grain, textiles, silver. So the Sumerians developed a price schedule, and when rulers would take the throne, very often they would announce a price schedule. In the laws of Hammurabi, for instance, a liter of grain was equal to 1 shekel of silver. Essentially, silver became a common denominator. Hammurabi said if debts are owed in silver, and they can't be paid in silver, then the cultivator can pay in the form of grain at a specified ratio. So you had administered prices within the temples and palaces, within the public large institutions for the payment of debts, but you also had on the quay area, outside the temple economy, in the mercantile sector, especially foreign trade, you did have a market exchange. And of course, in all of this, you had gift exchange. So the important thing is that gift exchange, administered prices, market exchange, all went together. And of course, there's the most important form of stages is what Polanyi left out. And of course, that's primitive accumulation, gravitization. Most wealth in history, and almost all the wealth in America today, is the result not of creating wealth, not of exchange, not of producing it, but of grabbing it. Ever since 2008, there's a reason why the 1% have got all of the increase in wealth, all the increase in income in America. It doesn't have to do with Polanyi's 3 stages. It's pure maneuvering, manipulation, and fictitious capital. So with that said, the important thing about money and debt in Sumer is if it's agricultural, what do you do when the crops fail? When the crops fail, obviously the debts can't be paid. So as it turns out, every ruler at the beginning of his throne in Sumer, Babylonia, and the Near Eastern regions would start with a clean slate. They would cancel the debts, they would free the bond persons, and they would return the lands that had been forfeited. This was exactly, the word for this in Babylonian was Anduraram. This is the root of the Hebrew word deror, which was the Jubilee year. So there was a long background for all of this. Having said that, I should say how I came to all of this. I began as a balance of payments economist for Chase Manhattan. My job was to analyze what countries could pay debts and what countries couldn't. It was obvious that Latin America couldn't pay debts already in the 1960s. I later taught at the New School for Social Research in the graduate faculty in the 1960s and 70s. Bob Heilbronner insisted that I leave because my money and banking course showed that debts could not be paid. He said it was unthinkable. I was also invited to the Institute of Policy Studies as an advisor on balance of payments. I pointed out that debts could not be paid. They said, that's unthinkable. We'll lose all credibility if we said it. I then went to the United Nations, UNITAR, and wrote reports throughout the 1960s on the debt issues between the North and the South. And that's where I met Carrie in the late 1960s at a UNITAR, United Nations Institute for Training and Research, in Mexico. And I headed the American delegation. I explained that within 3 years, Mexico was going to have to default, along with other countries. The rapporteur turned out to be from the American intelligence agencies, misrepresented what I was saying that there was, of course, all countries could pay. I stood up, demanded an apology from the president of Mexico, pulled out the American delegation, was followed out by the Russian delegation, the Malaysian delegation, and the conference ended in such a crisis that Mr. Echeverria did not become the head of the United Nations. So it all had a happy ending. But when I realized that there was such a fight, such a riot over debt cancellation, I began to write a history of debt cancellations in 1981. And it took me until 1984 it took me about 2 years to go back to Rome and to the biblical lands. But then I found out scattered hints that there was something in Mesopotamia about debt cancellations. And I began to read it, but there wasn't any economic history of Mesopotamia that had been written. And the Mesopotamian people, people who study that, usually have to accept all of the economic courses that say that, what we've been talking about. Now, yesterday, people mentioned that Karl Polanyi probably couldn't have written his work so congenially if he had been working in a university. And I think that's right. There's no way to fit into the curriculum what Polanyi's talking, what I'm talking about, and that's why I stopped teaching for many years, and essentially just wrote books and worked as a financial consultant for governments canceling their debts. To the north. I tried to publish a book about my findings in Sumerian and Babylonian. The trade publisher said, no, how could there be a debt cancellation? If debts were canceled, who would lend money? Well, the fact is that all these debts that you read about in the Bible and in Babylonia were not about people lending money. Most debts accrued, they were arrears. They were the debts that people would run up with the ale at a bar, like you'd run up a tab at the bar. They'd run it up and to be paid on the threshing floor if the harvest worked. And also, most debts were owed to the palace. So when the rulers canceled the debts, they were canceling debts owed to themselves. That's much easier than canceling debts owed to the oligarchy. And of course, if you cancel debts owed to American banks, you know what happens to you in the third world today. So not a good idea. And also, the debts are agricultural. And of course, when the crop fails, you can't pay the debts. The question is, what happens if the debts were not canceled? Well, that's what happened when, around 750 BC, all of the Near Eastern commercial practices, weights and measures, money, contracts, the concept of charging interest spread for the first time to the Aegean, to Greece and Rome, Italy. There had been no sign in the linear B of interest-bearing debts. So basically, this was decontextualized. These practices of charging interest were brought by local Near Eastern temples, but they were picked up by the local oligarchies. And what had formerly been a embedded public function, semi-public function, now became privatized. You had the privatization of credit, you had the privatization of money, and most of all, you had the privatization of land. And I want to, since I only have 3 minutes, I'll explain the theory of land that we've come across. Have you ever wondered how the labor that built Stonehenge in Avebury and Göbekli Tepe, 10,000 BC, it's even bigger in Turkey, was built? How did you get the labor? Or for the Egyptian pyramids? Most of the economic theory is written by right-wing anti-government people that imagine somehow if individuals didn't do it, it had to be slave labor, because we all know the government can only play a corrosive role, never a productive role. The fact is that all this labor had to be voluntary. If the labor didn't voluntarily work on Stonehenge and work on the Corvée, then you wouldn't have. They would have run away. They would have gone somewhere else. There was plenty of room. They all came together. We have the records, for instance, of the Egyptian pyramid builders. They were well-fed. They were not slaves. And there were continual feasts. And at the end of every Corvée section, there would be a big drinking party. And a feast. And the whole orientation was around feasts. This was the organizing factor. Now, gradually, this Corvée labor became so important for building palaces, city walls, irrigation ditches, that land rights were assigned to the people. The function of having land, every landowner, every citizen who had self-support land was obliged to provide labor in the Corvée season, and to serve in the military. And the function of land was not the way that John Locke describes it. Somebody puts their own effort into the land and then gets to collect a return on it. The effort was communal, and the idea of land was as an obligation. What created land tenure was the tax obligation. Before there were taxes, of course, because it wasn't a money economy, it was the taxes were paid in corvée labor and the military. Even the Roman Constitution defines each class according to the landholding that somebody has. So essentially, all of this became decontextualized in the West. So when people talk about Western civilization beginning in Greece and Rome rather than the Near East, they're talking about the decontextualization of the Bronze Age Near East. They're talking about when civilization first fell apart, and they're taking that as a model for how our economy should operate today. And it's bizarre.
Can you just imagine how wonderful it would be if economics was taught like that? Undergraduate from the beginning?
Because have to be an
Once.
anthropologist to do it.
All right, just accumulate your thoughts and your questions on such a rich program here. Don't forget one, please.
Thank you, Carrie. I'm glad to be part of this double commemoration as a member of the Polanyi tribe for 15 years now. And honored to be by the side of a living legend. My honor to call my friend. I usually use the Spanish pronunciation for Polanyi. I use Polanyi. I consulted a couple of dictionaries online, and it happens that in Hungarian the pronunciation is Polanyi. So I'm going to use the Hungarian pronunciation, which is like in Spanish. The Great Transformation and Polanyi in general, as you know, can be read from many angles. I'm going to try to read it from the geopolitical angle. As you know, this book contains the most comprehensive and devastating critique of capitalism and the self-regulating market by a non-Marxist intellectual. In his classic, The Worldly Philosophers, Robert Heilbronner documented that, as he put it, the birth of the market was the most important revolution from the point of view of shaping modern society that ever took place. Fundamentally more disturbing by far than the French, the American, and even the Russian Revolution. So this speaks of the pertinence of Polanyi's enterprise. A first point I make is that Polanyi developed his grand critique largely in the context of his examination of the collapse of British hegemony and Pax Britannica, under which 19th century civilization was born and flourished, ultimately. As you all know, the actual subject matter of the Great Transformation is the rise and fall of the 19th century civilization. So Polanyi undertook, that's the point, that enterprise primarily from a geopolitical perspective, from that point of view. So the three pillars on which this civilization rested were the balance of power, the gold standard, and the liberal state. He said the found and matrix of all three was the notion or the principle of the self-regulating market. As Kerry pointed out yesterday, she's right, fourth pillar was actually what Kerry calls political colonialism. In fact, the period from 1815 to 1914 is known as Britain's imperial century. So that attests to the importance of colonialism. But the decline of 19th century civilization was driven by economic factors. It began when the attempt was made to build an international economy based on the principle of the self-regulating market by means of the gold standard and haute finance. The failure of this utopian project, as Polanyi called it, led to World War I, and 2 decades later to the final collapse of that civilization, when the gold standard was finally abolished in 1931 after a brief restoration in the roaring 20s. A second point I make is that Polanyi conceived of capitalism ultimately as an universalism. Universalisms, that's the point, are therefore an implicit object of his critique of the market system. He addressed the question of universalisms in three major works. Of course, in his 1945 article, Universal Capitalism and Original Planning, in The Great Transformation, and in another long-forgotten article, as Bjorn had called the first one, The Essence of Fascism, which was published in 1935. So his premise was that all forms of universalism pose threats to societies. So Polanyi naturally linked his critique to the market system with the notion of the double movement, as this is a defense mechanism that is activated when broad sectors of societies are affected by universalisms and react by undertaking counteractive measures. In the essence of fascism, it's a very long, dense, and philosophical article. Walter Goldfrank, more than 2 decades ago in one of these conferences, said that Polanyi's struggle against the market mentality began with his essay, The Essence of Fascism. In fact, Polanyi began his critique of universalism in this long, heavily philosophical essay. He refers to some Vienna professor by the name Ottmar Spahn, who, contended that the German fascism, in its attacks to, it was attacking both the churches and the labor movement. So it became clear that German fascism was the common enemy of socialism and Christianity alike. That was what Polanyi contended, no Spahn. Spahn talked about the universalism versus individualism. And finally, Polanyi said that the churches, in bearing witness to universalism, stand for the essence of their faith, but so do also the German fascists in denying human equality to the last. In The Great Transformation, I'm just going to mention a couple of quotes. Polanyi mentioned that fascism and socialism were life forces in the institutional transformation, which is the subject of his book. Fascism and socialism found a vehicle in the rise of the individual powers which helped to spread their grip, Germany and Russia. So capitalism was spreading through the gold standard, which Polanyi called it its supreme vehicle, and also the great symbol of universalism. He said that liberal capitalism was legitimized on the basis of a law as universal in society as gravitation was in nature. So the universal principles on which capitalism was being legitimized were forced actually when the Spinham Land Law was abolished and the Poor Law Reform was promulgated in 1834, paving the way for a competitive labor market to finally take form in England. So, but he said also, yet simultaneously to the spread of capitalism, a counter movement was on foot. So it was not a usual defensive behavior, but it was a reaction against a dislocation which attacked the fabric of society and which would have destroyed the very organization of production that the market had called into being. Trent Schroyer said that this concept of the double movement constitutes a non-Marxist notion of dialectical movement and comes close to a theorem that provides the framework for studying the re-embedding of fictitious commodities. But Manfred Benfeld, in another of these conferences, said that Polanyi was wise enough as not to turn this concept into either a teleological functionalist or functionalist authority, or to claim that a double movement could return societies to a sort of stable equilibrium. In universal socialism, capitalism, or regional planning, Polanyi identified three forms of universalism. In addition to liberal capitalism, so war, revolutionary socialism, and Hitler's creed of racial supremacy and world domination. He saw these forms of universalism to break down by the time he was writing, and he said that new forms of socialism and capitalism, or planned and semi-planned economies emerged, each of them by their very nature regional. This process was almost exact replica of the establishment of the European states system about the end of the 15th century. So then he wrote this expression, which has been very, very much quoted, that says that the new permanent pattern of world affairs was now one of regional systems coexisting side by side. The United States, Polanyi said, that still upheld a universal conception of world affairs and strove to conquer the globe and restore the pre-1914 world order together with its gold standard. And he was actually sympathetic of Russia, by the way, because he said that the way Stalin had turned Russia's foreign policy from these ideas that were predominated under the idea of Trotsky, war revolutionary socialism, were turned into regionalism that was almost an isolationism. So he, in this article, he referred to the Soviet Union, British Commonwealth, and the United States. But Kerry yesterday pointed out that he also referred to other regions like Latin America, India, China, and Europe. But he didn't mention this in the article. So this expression that there was now a system of regional, or world regional system, that led many authors to understand that Polanyi meant a process of regionalization. By this meaning, regions forming by the voluntary integration of two or more states. But the fact is that he meant a regionalization of the three universalisms. That's the point I want to make. So, as I said, he was sympathetic of the Soviet Union and even of Stalin. He called it a daring innovator, as I mentioned. So he said, by rolling out universalist solutions like those promoted by the League of Nations, the Soviet Union had increased the chances for democratic socialism to succeed by giving a regional character to Russian socialism. On the side of capitalism as a universalism, the abolition of the gold standard forced capitalist countries to take control of their economies and so to manage their currency, their foreign trade, and their international financial transactions in order to plan for what Polanyi called their foreign economy. So it was a capitalism working on the basis of a network of domestically managed national economies, not as a single self-regulated international economy. So the regional planning for Polanyi was the instruments and organs of foreign trading, lending, and paying. It was the best alternative to the reactionary utopia Wall Street, entertained by the groups that sought to restore universal capitalism in order to preserve their privileges. So he said the battle of the gold standard was the great symbol of universalism, was therefore a struggle for and against regional planning, by this meaning the national management of national economy. Finally, I'm going to have, I don't have time to go over Björn Herne, who elaborated on Polanyi's insights, but I'm just going to finish by mentioning 3 more points I made out of what I referred.
Yes, could you please sum up as fast as
Yeah.
possible?
These are Polanyi's key insights and contributions. One is that universal societal models and forces can be harnessed by way of their regionalization into the territorial and institutional framework of large politics. Second, a territorial approach, as opposed to the functional one entertained by universal doctrines, is needed to study universalisms, a territorial response to the concrete manifestations of those forces. Third, societies can respond to universalisms by adopting a regionalist strategy as a double movement to protect themselves from the deleterious effects of the market. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this. Oscar. This is a very rich panel. I think we could have an entire session for each one of these presentations.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me. I am just coming into the tribe. It's never too late to come into the tribe. I've been working on the international financial architecture and how it is used to subordinate the global economy for the past 35 years. My most recent book, which is called The Genealogy of the International Financial Architecture from 1850 to 2008, was published 2 weeks ago in Mexico by my institute at UNAM. And last year I came out with a little book, which is a reflection, really. It's a book of thought of everything I had researched for this large thing, called The Great Mutation. What was funny was, I finished writing it, and I had to put a title to the book. I'm speaking about the mutation of capitalism from industrial capitalism to financial capitalism. But I'm also speaking about the mutation of the laws of finance. So, what am I talking about? And then I realized, and that was funny, then I sent Carrie an email, because to me it was shocking. I had read The Great Transformation 30 years ago. So I read it. Then I wrote this thing 30 years later, and then it dawns on me that what I am really doing is looking at is, self-regulation, does it work or not? Do they follow the rules of the game or not? Who puts the rules of the game, and how is power managed? Okay, So, okay, so I know where I am standing. And that was very funny, it was very shocking, because you don't realize the importance of something you've read, whenever it was, until you actually see it in black and white, and you don't even think about it. Normally we quote, no? But when it's so sort of in yourself, you don't think about it, you don't quote it, it's like, it's natural, this is, of course it's there. So that was very funny. I think the first thing that I have done in this trying to present the transformation of the financial system into a financial complex, into a banking financial complex, the first thing I've done is to define what is a system. And in physics, von Bertalanffy says that a system is something that can be defined because it's self-regulated. So an economic system is self-regulated. If it's not self-regulated, it's not an economic system. It's an economic, whatever you want, it's not a system. So the financial system, if it's not self-regulated, it's not a system. The second thing is, we can observe there are banks that are too big to fail and banks that have the right size to fail. The banks that are too big to fail are 0.15 of all banks in the United States. That's my universe is the United States. 0.15 of all banks in the United States are too big to fail. 99.84 something have the right size to fail. The effect of that is that between 2008 and last year, 457 banks went bankrupt in the States. The top 10 grew, and they grew substantially. Now, how can 0.15 of all banks grow when the economy is not growing and when they have produced the largest financial crisis since 1929? It's absurd. Logically speaking, if you produce a crisis, something is going to happen to your balance sheets because the GDP is going to fall, your clients are going to go bust, and you're going to lose money. That's the way it goes. But no, that's not the way it goes. GDP, financial sector GDP in 2009, when US GDP contracted by 3.5%, grew by 1%. So I wondered, how can this work? And after reading Simon Johnson's 13 Bankers, and after watching The Inside Job and watching all kinds of films and reading Michael Hudson's works and other works, I started to think, well, there seem to be 4 legs, and this is about power, and there seem to be 4 legs to financial power. This 0.15 banks that control 73% of financial assets in the States, first of all, control the Treasury. And that's fairly clear. The question was, since when do they control the Treasury? So I took the universe of secretaries of the Treasury from 1960 to 2013, and separated them in 2. Between 1961 and 1980, there are 2 secretaries of the Treasury that come from the financial sector. Between 1980 and 2013, there are 3 secretaries of the Treasury that do not come from the financial sector. The big switch is 1980. But what's in 1980? That's the beginning of the deregulation of the financial sector. The cherry in the cake is Robert Rubin, who was chairman of Citibank, pushes the last major piece of deregulation in 1999, and lands as CEO of Citigroup. So we have the banks, we have the treasury, we have a revolving door. But we have a revolving door with the great press. The great press, and this, when you travel all the time and you go all over the world, one thing we all do is look at the newspapers. And all of the financial sections of all of the newspapers have the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times or the New York Times or The Economist. Take your pick of the country you want, the language you want. There it is. Now, strangely enough, the United States and Great Britain are both heavily indebted rich countries. So they're not sort of preaching the word of their economic virtues, how well we're doing and how much we're growing and how well we manage our economy. No, that's not the point. The point is, how does a financial market work and how are we doing? And let's all be happy and let's think about this, the financial world. Let's not think about the real world. That doesn't matter. That's in your imagination. The only thing real here is the financial stuff. And that's now become a mechanism for the transmission of ideas. But where do the ideas come from? Academia. And in academia, and that's the fourth leg, in academia, there is, if you look, and I haven't done the count, but if you look at from 1974 to now, the number of Nobel Prize winners in financial areas is fairly large. And most of them are concentrated in Chicago, which is funny. And that concentration speaks about the perfect market, which we of course know doesn't exist. But that doesn't matter. Because, again, what matters is not reality. What matters is the discourse. It's the idea, on the idea. Ideacional, whatever, in English. So we're moving in a world of ideas. The ideas are being spread around by the large press, which is all over the world. And it's the same large press. So it's those three media or four media. And there is also, finally, a control or an influence on U.S. Congress. The participation of the financial sector in the donation of funds for the presidential elections and for congressional elections is the largest. Defense comes in number 13. And that to me was a shock. I used to think defense came first and then down came the financial stuff. No. Financial sector is the largest donator, the largest donor, and the defense sector is number 13. So what we have basically is a takeover of power. And the takeover of power, of course, is what put Paulson where he had to be, at the time where he had to be, and that's how $700 billion were transferred from the U.S. Taxpayers to banks. But not to 6,591 banks, but to 10 banks. And I think that's interesting. I think that's very interesting. So what we're speaking about is a disembeddedness of the top 10, of the 0.15% of the banks. The rest are embedded. They have rules of the game, they go bankrupt. They're supervised. The other ones don't even have a theory. I teach international finance, that's what I studied in London 1,000 years ago. The theories I teach are totally useless if you work for one of the top 10 banks in the world. Because credit does not follow the theory, risk does not follow the theory, and as a consequence, the interest rate theory does not function. Because it used to be that interest rates were the reflection of risk. Well, it turns out that if you're too big to fail, what's the risk? What's the risk? You are too big to fail, that's a definition. So, risk, what risk? Which complicates matters, because it means that capitalism has two rules of the game. And it has two sets of institutions, embedded ones, as we all know, and these very few disembedded ones for running the show. Thanks very much.
I don't know whether most of you know that these Nobel laureates in economics are not real Nobel Prizes. They're not given by the Nobel Committee that was set up by Alfred Nobel. They are decided upon in the Swedish Central Bank. And Bank of Sweden, its central bank, is part of this complex, and it's been controlled by very conservative landlords ever since they gave the first one of these economics prizes and issues. So remember, they're really not worth very much.
Only if it's
Comment on Oscar's.
Please, oh yes, please. Michael would like to comment, and incidentally, I would like to invite the platform here also to take part in to ask questions of others.
I have two comments on what Oscar said. He mentioned at the end that the myth that interest rates reflect risk, when of course, as you all know, banks say if there's a risk, they call it a crisis. And the government has to bail them out. But this silly theory has been applied to anthropology. In Sumer, the interest rate was 20% per year. In Greece, it was 10%. In Rome, it was 1/12 per year, 8 2/3%. People think this is because there was a security of property, defined as the oligarchy killing the landowners, taking over, enslaving the population, and saying that we have now secured property. But that's not what caused the decline in interest rates. The interest rate in every country, beginning in Sumer, was based on the unit fraction. In order to create money, you need a set of divisions. The original money was grain. You handed it out on a 30-day month, so you divided everything by 60th, two meals per day of barley. Now, 1/60th works out to 12/60ths a year, 20%. The doubling time was calculated at 5 years. The mathematical models used in Sumer were superior to any mathematical model that I've seen today. It was very simple. They've calculated the compound interest growing exponentially. Any rate of interest is a doubling time. They also calculated the real economy output, curves, growing at S-curves. So they knew that debt increases more rapidly than the ability to pay. That's what erotica meant in this fictitious capital. And that's why the debts were canceled. Greece used a decimal system, 1/10. So its interest rate was 10% per year. Rome, 1/12, because the troy ounce, as you know, is divided into 12. So 1/12 per year, you would have to pay 1 ounce. And the word for interest in all these languages was the word for a young kid or calf or birth. But what was born was the unit fraction from the big fraction. It was a metaphor. And the economists are so dumb, it's like reading a poem, about something and not realizing it's all a metaphor for something else. They don't realize that the birth that was not of cows or calves to pay interest. It was it was the birth of the fraction. And the final, one other point, when Oscar mentions the government and the state, every economy in history is a planned economy. The question is, who's going to plan it? And if the government doesn't plan it, it's going to be the financial sector. Aristotle got it right with his 3 stages. Democracy evolves into oligarchy, and then the oligarchy make themselves hereditary. We're going to see that today, hereditary fortunes, and into an aristocracy. And then finally, the aristocrats fight among themselves, and one of them takes the people into their camp, and you have back to democracy. That's the eternal triangle. There's always going to be a government, but the question is, will it be democratic, oligarchic, or aristocratic?
Wonderful.
She can't see you carry radical.
Sorry, can I just quickly add something?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that it's very interesting. I mean, just to add to that, I mean, how political money really is. If you look at the financial sector, there's all this supposed commodification of money going on, but in fact, the vast majority of these financializations actually rely on government debt. And why do they always obsess about deficit reduction? Because they want government taxation to go to have no other claimants on it than what is owing to them. They want to be not only first in line, but more or less the only people in line to receive revenues from taxation.
When we come to questions, here, could you line up by the microphone, please, if you have a question? I'm going to take 3 questions at a time. Please direct your question to the, if possible, to the respective person on the panel, and let's go and see how many questions we can do before we're told that we have to leave this room.
Peter Rucking. Radhika, you mentioned comparing Polanyi with Marxist thinking, the Marxist reference to the socialization of production. Those of us working in the field of social and solidarity economy use that term, but I'm wondering if it's in a different sense. We're talking about production to meet basic needs, cooperation, solidarity. Can you just refer to the commonalities and differences with the way Marx used that term? To Michael, fascinating presentation of the history of the problematique. When you said you're also advising occasionally governments, but maybe could you just give us a few feelers about, if you're thinking about strategy and what to do about all this, what sort of advice you're giving on all this and what might be done differently? And to Oscar, great analysis of, I think, the instrumental aspects of power, campaigns, contributions, revolving doors, and discursive power. Maybe the need to think more about also structural power and how the structural power of capital has increased under globalization and liberalization, with risk or threats of capital flight, capital strike, etc. I think that the 3 things of structural power, instrumental power, and discursive power are really key for analyzing what's happened to elite power.
Next.
James Sputzel from the London School of Economics. I'm going to talk about fictitious commodities land tomorrow, so that's a little advertisement, so some people say on for that late plenary. But I wanted to ask Radhika and Michael just 2 questions. The first one is, how would you assess Nigel Dodd's recent book on money? He's our LSE sociologist who's engaged with Polanyi sympathetically but critically, and has quite a negative assessment of the state and quite a kind of positive assessment of society's adoption of money as their own. So I don't know if you've read this yet, but I think it is sort of one of the big contributions.
What's the author's name?
Nigel Dodd. Well, have a look, because if you're reading Polanyi, you're reading about money as a fictitious commodity. I think it's going to be the subject of debate now over the next couple of years. The second question is about the kind of structural power behind finance. And I have a lot of questions about this, but I think what I want to do is just ask you to comment on the possibility in the South, among the emerging powers, for a challenge in relationship to the structure of international finance. We have just this embryonic formation of a BRICS bank, which is right now a drop in the ocean, but does it represent an important challenge in relationship to peripheral attempts to begin to consolidate an alternative finance?
And that would be the third question.
Yeah, very quickly. Andrew Fisher from the Institute of Social Studies. Again, two questions brief to Radhika and Michael. I mean, obviously you didn't get a chance to expand on the International Clearing Union, and I'm just wondering, particularly that also I know you're concerned about the global perspective. I mean, it's often said that Keynes wasn't particularly congenial towards the colonial colonies, and in this conception of the clearing union, and hence how would you incorporate that into your, just to give you the opening to expand on that. But also, and it relates to Michael's point, because I mean, as Jan Kregel says, the process of late development and catch-up and so on is inherently, how should we say, inherently generates global imbalances in a sense, and hence whether deficits and surpluses and so on, and the way that's being sort of structured in the world economy has changed over time in the post-war period. But then I'm just wondering how, I mean, I'm just fascinated by your experience in this, and how then does the whole indebtedness question relate to these issues of global imbalances in the context of late development? Because fundamentally that's what Latin America was very constrained by, and that you would have been studying.
Let's go to Radhika first.
Okay, I'll begin. Sorry, yeah.
Yes, just a quick question. It's Peter Brown from McGill. I just wondered if the panel could suggest anyone who works systematically on the relationship between finance and the Earth's biogeochemical processes.
Thank you, Joy. Radhika, would you start?
Yeah, thank you. I'll take, I can't answer Peter Brown's question, but I'll take in reverse order. So thanks, Andrew, for the question on Keynes and the colonies. And I particularly wanted to say that I'm sorry about not organizing myself well enough to get all my points out in time. But I do think that Karl's point about colonialism is a very important one, and I actually had an important thing to say about it, which is that if you, I wrote a paper last year for the World Keynes Conference, and in it I traced Keynes, the development of Keynes' thinking about international money from his first major book, Indian Currency and Finance, up to and including his recommendations at Bretton Woods, the Bancor and International Clearing Union. And what that shows very clearly is that the gold standard, Keynes clearly understood the gold standard had very little to do with gold as such. In fact, if I was not from India, I would call it the India standard, because it was all based on colonial surpluses, the principal source of which was India. So, or let's at least call it the colonial standard. Without colonial surpluses to export, there would have been no gold standard. And the precise reason why the United States cannot, and this is what I say in my book, offer world liquidity stably, is because it has no capital to export. And doing it via deficit remains subject to the Triffin dilemma. He was not wrong, despite all the yarns that are spun by policy-making authorities. So, I think that Keynes was not congenial to colonies. You're absolutely right. And here are two more very important points one has to remember. He had no soft heart for colonies, but Keynes's perspective evolved in direct tandem with the increasing difficulties of the British economy. Schumpeter once complained that Keynes's solutions were always British solutions, with British interests at heart, and he was right. I mean, Schumpeter was just envious, but anyway, the point is that Keynes did, and the thing is, it was Britain's decline from being an imperial power to being merely a national economy that concentrated Keynes's mind. And to me, the fact that the Golden Age was contemporaneous with decolonization is a very important fact. It is the loss of colonial markets that makes working class consumption central to the expansion of capitalism and gives post-war capitalism such benign dynamics as it had. I'm not saying it was all benign, but we all agree that it was relatively more benign than the present or the previous, the successor or the predecessor versions. So, therefore, finally, Andrew, your point, Keynes's whole design of the International Clearing Union was based on effectively reducing imbalances, which would actually reduce the need for money in the first place. You only need money if there are imbalances to settle. Okay, so you create a Bancor, but you also reduce the need for it. And the way in which he had envisaged the whole thing working was basically most societies would grow via internally directed stimuli, demand stimuli, and with with trade taking the place of basically exporting the few things you could make in order to import the few things you needed, sort of thing. And so it would be a very residual thing. And I think that, quite frankly, in the kind of world in which we live today, and by the way, in my view, it began in 1870. 1870 is the first moment of multipolarity, when America, Japan, Germany, etc., emerge in order to challenge the single power supremacy of Britain, and it has never been repeated again. The single power supremacy of the first industrializer is inevitable. The biggest brother is going to be much bigger for a while until the other ones grow up, sort of thing. So the point is then that, quite frankly, since that time we've been living in a world where, on the whole, especially for large countries, internally directed development leading to relatively few imbalances is the best way to grow. And I don't think
I
that
think
at the
that
moment we are,
Maybe a very good point to start.
Thank you.
That internal development of countries, of large countries and regions, is the best way to grow. I'm sorry, you were excellent, but we don't have the time to continue. Michael.
I want to take off to answer the questions with gold. In the Bronze Age economies operated on the basis of silver, maybe copper, and tin, and yet probably if there's anything you know, especially from Britain, about Sumer, it's the golden graves of Ur. Well, anthropologists, we tried to figure out, wait a minute, the people, the temples, the Palacios used silver. Who used gold? Who used gold? They decided that these were the barbarian people who came in, the nouveau riche. The nouveau gold was always the monopoly of the conquerors, and it was never really used as a means of payment. When it comes to the Bancor that Radhika liked, it's true. Keynes' idea for the Bancor was, well, if countries can't pay, then the United Nations or the IMF or the World Bank, the IMF will create free money. This is a terrible idea today. This would be the end of civilization because the money would be given, first of all, to the biggest deficit country, the United States, whose entire balance of payments deficit is military. Secondly, it would be given to third world countries to pay their debts to the American banks, polarizing the countries. The purpose of the Bancor is to indebt the debtor countries even further. And when it was asked, what do I say when I go to Russia and China? The first speech I gave before the Duma in 1994, I was under the impression they'd read Marx, which is silly. I don't know. I said I had good news and bad news. The good news is that they don't want your surplus value. The bad news is they don't want your surplus value, as you know, comes from squeezed out of labor. The bad news is they don't want your labor at all. All they want is your land and your natural resources. And the solution to prevent this and to prevent the kleptocracy is to have a natural resource tax, a land tax. We talked about this yesterday, that you tax what is not produced by enterprise, but is a free lunch. Everywhere that I would go, and my colleagues would go, trying to make land maps, the World Bank would send people and offer each city, we'll give you $1 million worth of computers if you don't do the land tax and you tax labor to stop consumption. You'll invest more, meaning more flight capital into the West. And Russia became the leading stock market. Same thing in China. It's true that the BRICS Bank is very small. The purpose of it is not to be a large supplanter of the IMF and World Bank. It's to create a new monetary order. That's what I talk about when I go there, and it's to create, essentially, the first thing we are going to do is define the concept of odious debts to simply repudiate the bad debts, such as those of Greece and those of Ireland, where the Irish government was tricked into taking all of the debts of its crooked banks and turning it onto the taxpayers, plunging the country into a lost decade of growth. In the other countries I work with, Latvia, the Baltics, all have a population drain. They've lost 20% of their population. That's the result of the disembedded economy, the free enterprise ideal. The neoliberalism is it's paid for by driving out the people. They don't want surplus value. They want the land, the resources, and as for the people, get out or die.
Oscar, would you like to contribute to this turning out to be?
I'd say what we're observing, and we are observing it, is a process of change in the architecture. Because the BRICS Bank comes after the Bank of the South, which is now already in operation, which is small, but it's already in operation, and it will have $63 billion in all, so it's not small. And we have the Chiang Mai Initiative of 2000, which is now a support mechanism worth $420 billion. What I still don't understand is why we're measuring in US dollars. And that's a discussion.
What has to be measured?
I would suggest we use some sort of a basket, which is not the special drawing right. We have to design a new basket. We should design regional baskets. And have the regional baskets weighed by the weight of the region to create a universal basket. That's not a special drawing right. Because essentially what we now have is that the four currencies that make up the special drawing right belong to highly indebted rich countries that have no growth prospect. So what kind of a reserve currency is that? You have a reserve currency of a country that owes over 100% of GDP in debt, has less than 1% growth, and has a budget deficit of 10% or more, and they are not showing inflation because they're not growing. But someday, somehow, some growth will come back, and then we'll see where that goes. So what we're having is currencies that used to belong to solid economies that are now the reflection of weak economies but strong power. And the strong power, and that's why we keep the dollar, is of the 0.15% of the banks. And it's them doing it. It's not even the US government. No, it's those 10 banks who are really running the financial show in the world. And that's why we read the same press all over the world. No? So we're in the process of change.
No. Are there more questions? No questions. I can't believe it. What time are we?
Can I quickly come back on a point Michael
Will somebody
raised?
tell me when we have to leave this room?
5 minutes ago.
5 minutes.
Wait, no,
5 minutes ago.
5 minutes. Oh, 5 minutes ago, but we're not here. Oh, is that Terry?
Can we get ready?
just quick come back to
Pardon?
If you want
It's
to
okay,
stick to the
Karen.
schedule, you have to finish it.
Yes.
I'm ready.
5 minutes later.
We have to finish.
Thank you. Anyway. Okay, thank you.
Wonderful.
That's my point.
Okay,
But people
so
who
not
say
that you
should be
understand that. Yeah.